you have to remain constantly curious, because obviously we've all got our own filters. So you may read something in one way and somebody else intended it in another way. So we were constantly going back, have I got this right? Is this what you're telling me? Kinds of ways of working. This is what we do, isn't it? We analyse transactions. I never thought it could work, but it worked so well.
This is the Transactional Analysis Podcast. Conversations on the theory, application, and spirit of TA. Co-hosted by Parul Arora and myself, Matt Taylor. Sponsored by the International Transactional Analysis Association and the European Association for Transactional Analysis. In this episode, Parul and I chat with Linda Gillham, who is a provisional teaching and supervising transactional analyst in the counselling field. We discuss the impact of technology and the use of TA concepts in online counselling and psychotherapy, the integration of physical and mental health, and Linda shares insights on the confusion around the counselling field and the need for clarity and support in training.
Hi, Linda. Welcome to the Transactional Analysis Podcast. So good to have you here today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
I'm joined by Matt, who's going to be the co-host today. So, Linda, tell us a little bit about your roles and responsibilities.
Okay, so at the moment, I'm working in private practice and I also have supervision groups. I'm working hard towards my PTSTA, which I'm hoping to take in not the too distant future. And I've just recently been working for a healthcare app. So I've been doing lots of stuff with tech and online. So it's been an exciting past 4 years now I've been doing that.
That sounds really interesting. What a load of different applications for counseling. I'm excited to get into that. How did you get involved in this? Tell us a little bit about how you got involved in this aspect of counseling.
So my history, I started in clinical psychology. So I was on the route to do a doctorate. And I had to do 2 different placements. So I did one in an adolescent psychiatric setting. And then I moved into a therapeutic community. So I moved to working with personality disorder. And that was where I came across TA. So I found that working more in the clinical and the psychiatric setting in particular, it was very much a do-to using the medical model. And when I moved into working in the therapeutic community, I found that they did much more do with. So we were with our clients, as we call them, all the time, all week. So we were in group sessions 3 days a week. And so we got to know each other. And I much preferred that way of working rather than that power differential of I'm the professional and you're the patient. And so that's when I found TA counselling and started my training.
I love what you said, the power differential, because a lot of times we get attracted to TA because of that, okay, I'm okay, you're okay philosophy. So you mentioned that you see yourself at the edge of TA. So what do you mean when you say edge of TA?
So I think because I chose TA counselling as opposed to the other fields, at the time I was pretty clear why I chose it, because of the 2 branches in particular, the complementary and the primary offered different ways or more ways of being able to use the TA theory. Mm-hmm. So that was partly behind my decision in the beginning. And then now, more of this later with what I've been doing recently, it's paid off tenfold, being able to use TA in a complementary way. So casual conversations, etc. I've also been able to use it to write content, to do psychoeducation, but also the primary counselling. So I've had a private practice now for 10 years where I have basically been doing primary counselling. So it offered more opportunities in my eyes, and that was part of the reason that I chose it.
I'm curious about your distinction between the 2, and I'm really interested in the complementary counselling and how that might be understood or how you might explain that.
Yeah, it is much more about casual conversations in some ways and psychoeducation, that kind of thing. So anybody could train in TA counselling, and people like, I don't know, anything from a vicar to a hairdresser to a healthcare worker to a nurse to anybody that wanted to add TA to their repertoire and to talk with people, the concepts of ego states, for example, being aware of these types of theories, etc., and all the things that come, and mainly in the classical TA, can be so beneficial just in really short exchanges. So it doesn't have to be sessions, it doesn't have to be structured. You can just have these conversations and use what you've learned when you're talking to other people out in the world. What I'll say is that in the UK, TA counselling is tiny. There are very few of us that are either CTA, PTSTA or TSTA. And so it's been quite difficult to find a place in the UK TA community. And so what that has kind of led me to do really is to look outside the UK and to look more into the world. For example, my supervisor now is a counselling supervisor. They're based in Australia, and I've supervised groups in India, in Japan. I've been part of a PTSTA group that was international, mixing with other people from different countries who are also counsellors and psychotherapists. But it's meant I've had to look much more outside of the UK. I think there's a lot of confusion about counsellors in the UK, because usually you go to a local college or maybe a university and you study counselling, and it's often through levels. This is how it progresses in the therapy system in the UK, and it's part of what they're trying to regulate now. So the BACP, which is the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapists, have this process called SCOPED that they're currently working through to put people in different columns, as they're based on primarily on their training, but also some of the criteria is around experience. But it's meant that I've been put in that bucket, for want of a better word, when actually I'm not a counsellor. I'm a certified transactional analyst that works in the counselling field, and that's quite different. So I don't really fit into either camp.
It's a group of one.
Sometimes.
Okay.
Do you, for our listeners outside of UK, talk a little bit about SCOPED? Because I'm not sure everyone's familiar. So how does that play a role?
Sure. So it's been going on now for quite a few years. I wouldn't like to say exactly how many, but it's more than 5 years now. And it's around regulation. And don't get me wrong, therapy in the UK needs regulation. Anybody can call themselves a counsellor or a psychotherapist with absolutely zero training. We've also recently seen an influx, particularly from the USA, of companies like BetterHelp who have come along and are stealing, for want of a better word, the clients that are around in this country, undercutting prices, etc. And they can do that because it's an unregulated profession. So the regulation is definitely needed, but there's been an awful lot of confusion, in particular for people around which column they may fit in, what they have to do to get into a column. Senior accreditation, they've downgraded to accreditation, and you have to reapply for senior accreditation. So there's lots going on in the therapy world, most of which clients are completely unaware of. But it's causing quite a lot of chaos and confusion, particularly for trainees. Are you on a course that when you finish it, you're going to find you can't register? It's really in flux at the moment. So it's a difficult landscape in the counselling field.
I'm just wondering, do other nations have a similar sense of confusion and complexity?
No, I think it's much clearer. I mean, particularly in Europe, often you would complete a different training before you would do TA. So you may do a first training in psychology or a medical training, and then TA would come after that. So it's a lot clearer, I think, in many countries. Not sure it's quite the case in Australia. I think there's a fair amount of confusion there. And I think also maybe Parul in India as well, you're nodding.
I think regulation is something that we are all working through in India as well. And there's a lot of times clients are not clear, right? Whether it's what to expect from a counselor versus someone else, or a clinical psychologist or a psychotherapist. So it's also, like you said, a little bit blurry for the clients. So I wonder how you see that the roles, are they corresponding or alien to what the society needs, not just what the TA field needs?
Well, I think they're complementary. In the UK, there's been a long history of a hierarchy with psychotherapy at the top and counselling sort of further down, like a little bit like the poor relation. And some of that is in TA and in the whole community, but definitely in the TA community. So often people training TA counselling along the way to diploma level before they get to their psychotherapy qualification. So I've had so many comments over the years of, oh, you're just counselling, because there's this lack of understanding that TA in the TA world, counselling and psychotherapy are the same level. Whereas in the rest of the world, often psychotherapy training is longer, often it involves therapy. Counselling tends not to at college sort of level. It's encouraged, but not mandatory. So there's a lot of confusion around membership of organisations, which one, which level, it's very confusing at the moment.
And you said that it's also how you train. One is longer, one is shorter. So are you thinking about the functional aspect of the limitations that the two come with, or the need of the client?
In TA, the training is the same. So it's 450 hours, whether you're counselling or psychotherapy. But often counselling diploma courses are 1 to 2 years in like I say, in local colleges, etc. And then psychotherapy training is more likely to be nearer 4 years. So yeah, there is that length. There's definitely a difference in the length of training outside of the TA field.
Yeah. When you say you feel like you're on the edge of TA, so it sounds like you're talking about the UK TA community.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find really fascinating about that is that of late, there has been a lot more discussion around the topics of power, privilege, oppression, intersectionality, all that kind of thing. What I'm hearing is that is also present in the TA community, which I guess it is going to be in any community at an unconscious level. And I wonder what you think needs to be done in order to shift that. We have had conversations. We had a panel discussion. I don't know whether you heard it.
Yes, I heard
with
it.
all 4 fields about the future of TA. And there was a bit of discussion around that, and the counselling field being the newer field of the 4 with organisational, educational, psychotherapy. Yeah, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what could be done to shift that or change that.
So I think there's definitely something about raising awareness, because if you're going to go for CTA in whichever field, you have to have 150 hours of supervision. So this leaves 75 hours of supervision that you could have in any field. And what I would say is I would really recommend that people explore this, because if you're going to go through the different levels of qualification in TA, when you're facing your TEW, for example, it is super useful to have some educational training behind you. This is how you learn to teach. This is how you learn how people learn. And so that you can go on and be a PTSTA. But also from the organisational field, we work with systems. Our clients come to us. Often they are employed in organisations. So having some understanding and more of a meta perspective of their world is really, really useful as you go through your journey. So I think there's something about raising awareness that this is an option. You can have a different supervisor while you're studying for your CTA or you're doing your writing, and you can choose who you want to work with. If you want to do teaching in the future, find someone in education and do some work with them. So it can be flexible. I guess that's the main thing that I want to say. That's how I feel it could change.
Okay, so in the training process, somebody who's, say, training in psychotherapy could get 75 hours of supervision with somebody who's an organisational teaching and supervising transactional analyst or an educational. And
I'd really, really encourage people to do it, because you need that.
Yeah. I think I've benefited, actually. For me personally, I didn't log these as my hours for my CTA, which I've just recently passed, but I've classified personally my conversations with people like yourself in other fields through the podcast is incredibly informative for me in understanding my psychotherapy clients. And it's really filled the gaps for me.
Because you think, part of learning TA and while you're training is learning to become autonomous practitioners. So it's a really great time to tap into that and think, what do I need? I'm getting what I need psychotherapy-wise, or maybe you are in an organisational or educational field and you want to learn a little bit more about counselling. You can do this. You can have supervision with other supervisors, and you can do other CPD too, to give you a window into the other ways that TA is used.
Yeah.
I love the way you've opened it up. You've just, brought a concept which is like you can do this, this, and this, and it's not all watertight. And the way you talked about flexibility, I see that in the ways that you've applied it in your own career so far. You've applied it in different fields. So what do you feel was helpful for you to be able to do that, starting with counselling?
So I think the main thing was how my training focused on process. So there was so much around process and systems and organizations, etc. So it meant that I can use the concept interchangeably with different presentations. So not just in the therapy room with one client facing me, I can use it in groups. It's been massively helpful in supervision, particularly group supervision, is thinking about parallel processes, encouraging my supervisees to take more of a meta perspective than just to think what's going on between me and my client. And I know we're going to talk more in a moment about what I've been doing more recently, but I don't think without that breadth of training, I would have been able to do what I've been doing for the last 4 years.
And you mentioned parallel process. For those who don't understand it, do you want to just go a little deeper into that?
So if you think that there's a process, so for example, if you're with a client, there may be a process, I don't know, a simple process might be that they always show up late or they aren't paying, or those kinds of difficulties that we all encounter, with clients from time to time. You may find that that process transfers into your supervision, for example. And so you may find that one day, the next time you want to take this client to supervision, you're late. And you think, hang on a minute, what's going on here? Or you may forget to pay your supervisor. So it's a very simple example, but those are the kinds of things I mean by a parallel process. I had one recently in a supervision group, actually, where one of my supervisees started to talk really, really fast. And we were talking about their clients, hurry up. And, all of us were like, whoa, what's going on? Because, they really wanted to get through what they wanted to tell us. And I was like, they are not usually like this.
Yeah.
So it was how the client had come into the room.
Yeah.
With us, literally.
Yeah, I've had that when I've brought a client to supervision. And what I'm bringing is the client is presenting with a real confusion or a lack of clarity. And often with those clients, when I bring them, I don't know what I need from the supervision. And I'm just kind of rambling with my supervisor, and we have to stop and examine, okay, what's going on in this process? And it is a really fascinating thing, isn't it? That parallel process phenomenon.
So you mentioned parallel process. What other concepts do you find flexible that way, or, they're transferable between different things that you're doing? What are your favorites?
I always struggle with this because I kind of describe TA as through me like a stick of rock, and I don't really like to have favorites, if that makes sense. But I do have favorites, obviously. So things like the cycles of development, lots of classical TA has been absolutely brilliant for me recently. Co-creative TA, I like to talk about the integrating adult, with clients as well. Role theory. I mean, I'm kind of thinking through role theory at the moment because there's a lot of confusion. I mean, I have a BACP senior accreditation certificate that says I'm a counsellor / psychotherapist. I'm not. In the TA world, I'm a counsellor. There's some confusion straight away. And there is that contamination of roles. Can anybody really say that they sit in a session with a client as in their counselling, or are they straying into psychotherapy, or are they using some organizational theory because they've brought a work issue? It's blurry. So role theory has been useful in thinking about how some of this contaminates and confuses. And I hear it through my supervisees, trainees are confused.
Yeah. So do you think there's a responsibility with the institutes, the TA institutes that are training, to be more clear about the functions of the roles? Or is it just generally across the board in the UK, all counselling, all?
Well, I think given what I said about autonomy, the responsibility lies with the trainees, the supervisees, the people in the different worlds. And it does depend which organisation, for example, you want to register with. Maybe you want the BACP, maybe you want UKCP. These are all, UK options. So I do think the responsibility lays with the people that are in the trainings, but maybe some support and direction, because there is a lot to plough through.
There is.
And some of it's conflicting.
Yeah. So
maybe there is a space for some training around the different levels, competencies, things that you need. I'll often hear confusion about, do you need this many hours or that many hours, or do these hours count? oh no, these hours don't count and I've spent all this money on them. But ultimately, it's in the handbooks of the institutes. And sometimes people just need directing a little bit more closely into where to look, to how they want to form their identities. What is their identity when they finish training? That's part of that.
Yeah. I like how you make that co-creative responsibility, that it's both and rather than one or the other. Yeah, great.
Otherwise, I think you get into a culture of blame.
Yes.
And that's not helpful for anyone.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I agree. One of the things you said, Linda, was about what you've been up to recently, and you mentioned tech. And Parul and I have just done this episode with Ronan Stillman, and we're really interested in the follow-on, you talking about tech a little bit. So perhaps you could tell us a bit more about that.
Okay, so when lockdown hit, it was March 2020, and we went online, which now feels like a very far distant memory, as if, I can't imagine not ever being online now, but that's how the world was, wasn't it? And some of my clients weren't too keen of going online, so they started to move away. We were told to start with that the lockdown was 2 or 3 weeks, which now again seems ridiculous. But so they said, oh, we'll come back in the summer when this is all over. So I applied for a role with a healthcare app, something I'd not really come across before, other than things like Headspace I was familiar with, but nothing more than that. And so over that summer, I worked on an asynchronous chat service, supporting about 1,000 people in workplace, in organizations with various different difficulties. It combined physical and mental health, which I really liked. So it was a really integrated approach to supporting people. So people could talk to nurses about their physical health, and then if they were struggling with their mental health, they would come over to us. So for example, if somebody came onto the service diagnosed with low testosterone, if that happened at a GP practice, they would be maybe given medication or given some advice and sent away. But with the app, they were given that same advice from a specialist nurse, but then they would also come to us to work with things around the low mood, which is another symptom of low testosterone. So it was a really combined way of working. So I'd never worked with chat before. You've got no body language. You've got a username. You've got somebody who just sends you a message. And I can say, before I say anything else, transference definitely does come over a chat. I learned that over time. But we had like this phrase that we would use, that we were always in your pocket. So we were open for service hours 9 till 6, but someone could send a message any time of the day and it'd be picked up during service hours. And my biggest sort of baptism of fire over that summer was menopause, because it wasn't really talked about then. GPs, it was really hard to see a GP. There wasn't much education out there. And all of a sudden I'm working, one of our services was the menopause service. So I'm thinking, I've got to find some tools and techniques within TA to support, this community of people. And I started to think about things like their culture. Where would they get that information from? Would it be from a relation? If there's no access to the kind of GPs, the menopause clinics closed, to think about how can we fill this gap? And so I thought a lot about this, and then I ended up writing a paper actually for the Yukata magazine, and thinking about, the cycles of development. So, in later life, what does that look like? Are we recycling? Things like the psychological hungers, crisis and autonomy, when people say, well, my life this is the beginning of the end, and inviting people to turn that round and think about, no, it isn't actually, it's the start of something new, and thinking about life positions, supporting them to be able to go to work or to work online when they were experiencing all these different symptoms. So that was kind of the first learning, I guess, of how can I get TA into this, into these difficulties? How can I get these across? And then after that, we started fertility. So I was working with people experiencing large amounts of grief and loss, frustration. Fertility clinics were closed. They had no access. Then we added a parenthood service. So there were people that were having to give birth alone, and they were messaging us. It was a really, really, really difficult time. And like I say, I sort of think of it as a baptism of fire of, I need every tool that I've ever learned to try and support these people, or to give them concepts and coping strategies to get through. It was like that for almost the first 2 years. We were in and out of lockdown, weren't we? And I think one of the main things to come out of it, when we launched our women's and men's health service, is that everyone in the world was saying that men don't talk. You know, there's like this cultural thing. Oh no, men don't like talking. But again, strangely, they did. They would come on the chat and they would text us because there's that disinhibition, I guess. There's that anonymity to it. And so we did some great work with lots of men: stress, anxiety, burnout, personal life, professional life. Again, some role theory coming in there slightly. And then as we went on, it developed, it needed content. So it was a very early startup when I started, and we filled the app with content using pretty much all of the classical TA stuff. You know, we had the drama triangle in there and we had ego states in there and everything. And then we moved on to do what we called broadcasts. So we did hour-long kind of teaches, really, to people around the different concepts and invited them to talk on camera, and many of them did. They were usually between about 100, 150 people would get each time. So I was really proud of that part in particular. Well, because I was just getting it out there, you know, on a weekly basis. It was all over the app and all over our broadcasts, etc. And again, couldn't have done that without that breadth of training, that thinking about how you can apply these concepts to so many different people's positions.
You were hitting a lot of different issues. I had imagined, because of the situation that the nation was in, the world was in, this lockdown, and, you know, not being able to speak to or meet with the usual support systems. That's so interesting. So a couple of questions. The support that you were giving, that was over text as well, effectively. So you must have got really efficient with how much you wrote and how much impact you would get distilling.
Yeah. Sometimes we'd get massive messages, and sometimes we'd get 2 or 3 lines, and you'd have to be able to read between the lines. You have to remain constantly curious, because obviously we've all got our own filters. So you may read something in one way and somebody else intended it in another way. So we were constantly going back, you know, have I got this right? Is this what you're telling me? Kinds of ways of working. But I mean, this is what we do, isn't it? We analyze transactions. I never thought it could work, but it worked so well.
Did it? And did you have outcome measures? So where you were kind of gauging where people were at on their journey through the work? We
had outcome measures on the courses. So we wrote some short courses because we found that people were asking very similar questions. So we could say to them, okay, we hear you're really anxious. Go and have a read of this for, say, 6 weeks. Sometimes we unlocked them weekly. Sometimes we unlocked them all at once so people could do it in their own pace. And then we would measure success based on beginning and end. We also had measures in our emotional support service. So in the fertility, what we called a vertical, and we used Vertical for that. So we would collate data around whether the emotional support that we offered was making a difference. And unsurprisingly, it did.
Broad experience.
Yeah, and such important things, right, at that time. Like you said, menopause, fertility, parenthood. It's when you're in a crisis situation, like when you started, these aren't the first things that people are trying to solve for. And to have this kind of support, it's so valuable to be able to do that. And that it's making me think about the ratio. You know, we are all talking about how few trained practitioners are there to the kind of epidemic we are seeing with mental health. And I'm wondering, with this kind of application where you're able to do almost brief therapy or short-term counseling, how that plays a role right now when there's such a need for more and more people to be trained. And, you know,
I think, again, it's a round process, because if you think about what I've been talking about, you know, the themes, anxiety, grief, loss, stress, burnout, often relationship issues, they ran through everything. So if you can work with anxiety, you can work with somebody that's really anxious about their 2-week wait in fertility, for example. If somebody is struggling with burnout, you can work with any of the services on burnout. So it's thinking more about the process than the actual detail of what is going on. It's not the he said, she said. It's how you can use your skills and knowledge and concepts to work with people on their processes. And that's where the biggest change tends to happen.
And that you don't need to go deep with everything. You don't need to break the house to renovate a room in that sense.
I think anything, if someone has, you can't solve a range of issues in a short space of time, obviously, and deeper work is very valuable for people that want to do that. But I think in that situation, when we were in a crisis situation, when people had a problem, they wanted a solution. Even if it's just one problem, they wanted some relief from the symptoms that they were experiencing, for example. Maybe they started to have panic attacks. And so they wanted some physical techniques to alleviate them in the moment. And they wanted to touch on what might be contributing to these. And it may be that it was menopause. And so they would go off and speak to a menopause nurse and look into either natural or HRT solutions. And this was the beauty, I think, of the physical and the mental in the same space, because we could cover both in an integrated way, also very quickly. The turnaround was quick. It was 2, 3, 4 hours between the two services at the busiest times, rather than waiting weeks or days, for an appointment that then possibly got changed or cancelled. So that's how things were then.
That's fantastic. I think for me, one of the things that you're speaking to is that even since lockdown, there has been, from my experience, a lot of people talk about the lack of their own support network, or their support network lacks the expertise and the knowledge that maybe when we lived in tribes or smaller villages, there would be someone in the neighborhood who we could go and turn to talk about the menopause or fertility or mental health in some way. And I personally think that one of the challenges in the UK is the accessibility around affordability. If you have the disposable income to be able to afford 40, 50, 60 pounds, 70 pounds, whatever, for your therapy, great, per session. But if you don't, that's a real challenge. And I wondered if you thought there was opportunities for delivering a wider service outside of this particular company that you are working for. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, again, even at the organisational level, things are difficult. So if you think about the model in America, very often it is the employer that is responsible for the employee's health or their health in care, their health insurance. And it's not really the case here at the moment. But whether we do move more towards that model, because I went to a BACP cost of living crisis roundtable last December, and to hear how the employee assistance providers are struggling, they haven't got unlimited budgets. They can't put everybody forward for therapy in a company. They can't afford to. So it's not just at the client individual level, it's also at a business level that it is very hard now to be able to offer therapy for people, because it costs a lot of money. I mean, there's more and more, I think, low-cost services which are thriving, which is really good to see. They're not quite as low as they used to be. Again, obviously, there's overheads. Everything is more expensive, isn't it, than it was. And I have quite strong feelings about trainees working for free. Okay. I'll be honest, because I feel if a trainee is ready to do client work, they're also ready to be paid for that client work. I don't think it's fair that people have to do so many hours unpaid. But again, that is the model at the moment in the UK, is that a lot of the low-cost services are employing trainees so that they don't have to pay them. So it's difficult. We're stuck in a bit of a cycle, I think, at the moment, and there's not much clarity on the way forward, I don't think. Not yet.
So I'm hearing that in some ways it needs some strong leadership in regards to making these changes. And I'd imagine there's politics involved, as there always is. It's good to get your perspective on it, though.
Yeah. So, I think there are a lot of politics involved, and there's a lot of information put out, isn't there? How there's going to be a paid school counsellor in every school in the country, etc. There's like a drive for this at the moment. I don't know if that's actually happening yet, but I mean, I did some work as well around policy in my time working for the app, because there was recently the government put out a women's health policy, but there was no men's health policy. So I did some work with some colleagues around that, and we submitted evidence to say what is needed, particularly in men's health, because it's such a high suicide rate, in this country. It's never going down, it's always going up. And so we put forward quite a lot of evidence about things that were so people had access that was convenient to them. It's no good saying, go and make an appointment in 6 weeks' time. 6 weeks is too late. So again, maybe more app-based stuff or time-limited stuff, or being a little bit more economical with contracting, etc., so that you are doing symptomatic relief and then moving on to longer-term therapy if the person can avoid that. But that tends to be what people come with. This is happening for me right now and I'm struggling. I need to resolve this. And maybe the longer-term work is for people who can afford it till this, maybe these things change with the cost of living, if it does change. But it's tough out there at the moment.
Yeah. Hear you talking about men's health, and you mentioned it briefly that men find it easier possibly to access service via anonymous text rather than a face-to-face. And yeah, there are some real issues there, aren't there, around shame of not being well or shame about having mental health issues.
And we did one-off consultations with people, and it was a chat, really. It was a chat about, signposting services, what's available for you. But it was often the men that said, oh, is this what therapy's like? Oh, I could do this, because they didn't know.
Yeah.
They thought it was all, I don't know what they thought, but they didn't think that they could do it. And so we would just go, this is what therapy is. I go, oh, maybe I'll go and get some. And that was good to hear too.
I think that's so important to see health holistically. It's not just mental health or physical health. And when you remove that distinction or the barrier, it just becomes so much easier. You just realize you spoke to someone and that was a session of counseling, right? You just got a point of view and that was counseling. So health, if we can start talking about it like that, just becomes accessible to so many more people.
And that was partly why I wrote the thing on menopause, because I didn't consider it before then. If I was working with clients, I didn't think, oh, I wonder if they're in the menopause. It didn't enter my head. So I really wanted to put out there that, it may be that it's your partner that's experiencing menopause symptoms and doesn't know who they are anymore. It might be your sister. It might be your boss. It might be the person you're sat next to at work. It affects everyone. And so I was really keen to get that message into the therapy room, think menopause. So things like that, because it has physical impact and it has mental impact. It's the whole, it can't not. We can't have one in isolation of the other.
It's that old Cartesian mind-body separation, isn't it, that the medical world has bought into and is the model. But there is no separation. It's
a bit like us as individuals, isn't it? There's no separation for us from our systems either. We don't wander around in isolation. The things around us have impact.
And it's also interesting in the context of what we started talking about, how is counseling different from the others? And I feel like we just like to make separation when there doesn't need to be one. Like you said, it's complementary. It has its own roles. It has its reason to exist. And sometimes both can be equally valuable.
I think they're different. I work with my clients on what they bring. Do I do psychotherapy sometimes? Of course I do. But I work in the counselling field. Do psychotherapists do counselling? Of course they do. Well, they train in it before they train in psychotherapy.
Yeah.
But it's just not that clear. The distinctions just aren't as clear.
I just happened to today, as I was clearing out this room, I came across the BACP's journal called Therapy Today. I've got a copy here. And there's an article in it about psychotherapeutic counselling and how the approach would be that you separate them at all times. You either do psychotherapy or you do the coaching. And I appreciate the ethical boundaries and the reason why that has been suggested in that way. However, I thought that's really difficult because, again, there's these blurred lines. We're on a continuum of sorts and it is hard to make those distinctions. So fascinating that you say that there needs to be more clarity. I guess having a discussion, having conversations, getting things noted down. I think this is maybe part of the tension that we see in the TA community, isn't it, with the psychotherapy and the counselling, and sometimes one being seen as superior or being communicated as subtly, implicitly as superior than the other. There needs to be more conversations about exactly what's going on here.
That's a conversation I think that needs to be had, and hopefully in the future we'll have more such discussions. I'm curious to hear going forward what exciting for you, Linda? What is keeping you motivated, excited?
So I've always got so many fingers in so many pies. So, which is a good thing. It's a good thing. So I've just sort of qualification-wise, I've just reapplied for my senior accreditation with BACP. So I'm working towards my TSTA in the TA world, working with clients and supervisees in private practice. I've just done some training. I'm in the middle of some training actually around autism and ADHD.
Great.
Because I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah.
And also some fertility counselling maybe on the cards too. So all my skills, I guess, that I've learned in the last 4 years can now come into my private practice, and I can put quite a few strings to my bow, to be fair. It feels like, from the work that I've been doing. So my first love is primary counselling and supervising. They are definitely my first love. And I've kept that thread, albeit small, throughout working for the app.
Great. Sometimes hard to choose, isn't it?
Yeah, I like the variety. I do like variety. I couldn't imagine being, for example, a bereavement counsellor or just working in one area. I like the different presentations that people bring.
So yeah, I'm aware that we're coming towards the end of the episode. Linda, you talked at the beginning about being on the edge of TA, and I'm curious as to how that might be different in the future and how you might navigate your way to being possibly more central, or what needs to happen in the TA community as well, in order for things to shift there.
Beginning to answer that, I have to own my own part of the process in this. Obviously, I've got a big don't belong and a don't exist, which I've done many, many years of therapy around. I think that's part of why I chose TA. I think it is seen often as a bit more of the antisocial type of therapy. Maybe that fits with me. Who knows? I remember somebody giving me "I'm okay, you're okay" at like the age of 19 and thinking, that's not a book for me. Here we are.
That's funny. I had similar.
Far too small, the words for me then. But yeah, so I think it's just about, the thing that's changed is that people come to me. Historically, I had to go and try and find my tribe, and I gave up many times. But that's not the case anymore. People are much more likely to seek me out now. So I suppose I'm a little bit more comfortable at the edge, and it's okay to be at the edge.
Yeah.
I think that's possibly what's shifted. And also, like I say, I have look out into the world as well. My training was very international, given lots of opportunities then and again now with supervision, etc. through ITAA. It's a big world out there. You don't have to be on your own. I guess that's what the main thing that I've learned more recently.
Great. Love it. It's one of the things that I really love about the TA community is the standardized training across the world, which means that we can work with each other from any part of the world, and especially now since lockdown.
And we have a common language. That's what I love. We don't have to sit in a room and think, what am I going to say to this person? We've already got that common language, and, working with translation, etc. It's difficult at times to do, but it does translate. I've examined with a translator and had really good.
Yeah, I had two translators in my exam, and it was a fantastic experience. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe only on the fringes and on the edges in the UK, but belonging internationally. Fantastic. Love it. It's been really lovely to chat to you.
Amazing.
Really interesting, especially around this area, again, about tech and how that can be something that we can work with effectively.
Absolutely. It's definitely not something to be frightened of. I mean, AI, ChatGPT came in during that time. I can't remember when. It's a couple of years ago, I think now, and everyone was terrified it was going to kind of take over the world, I think. And yes, it does have its uses, but it's not going to replace us.
Thank you, Linda, on that very uplifting note. I love how you broke down so many of those silos that we have and how you expanded the possibility of having different kind of supervision, different kind of roles, different application. There's just so many breaking down of boundaries in this conversation. It was very interesting to hear from you, and thank you for being so open and authentic about this entire thing.
Thank you very much for having me. It was far more enjoyable than I thought it would be. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah, we like just having a chat. It's great. Wonderful. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
No, thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you.
As always, if you found anything in today's episode interesting, please feel free to reach out. You can visit our website, which has lots of information and resources, tapodcast.com. You can connect with us on all major platforms such as Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And you can email us at info@tapodcast.com. If you aren't already, please follow us wherever you get your podcast from. And we would really appreciate a review on the platform you're listening on as well. It helps raise the profile of the podcast and TA. Thanks for listening.
Sponsored by the International Transactional Analysis Association. You can find more information on the ITAA at www.itaaworld.org and the European Association for Transactional Analysis. You can find more information on IATA at www.iatanews.org.